In this video, I want to dive deeper into Blazor. So we are going to start learning CSS, which is a big topic unto itself, but it's cascading style sheets. It's the language of styling and display for our Blazor application. So it's how we can change how things look and how they're laid out on the page. And in addition, we're going to learn what two-way data binding is. And last time we learned about one-way data binding and events. So two-way data binding will be a slight tweak on what we already know. And by the end, we'll have an application that looks something like this, where we can change the color of this area on our page by clicking these buttons. We can get a random color, and we can also type in colors ourselves here and change the element on the page. So to get started, we're going to create a new Blazor application, and I am using .NET 5, which came out recently. I recommend installing that in Visual Studio, so updating your Visual Studio to the latest version, which will have .NET 5. And then when you create your Blazor application, let me drop this onto my desktop. Colorizer. So when you get to this place in your Blazor application, if you have .NET 5 installed, you should have this drop down here, and you can choose it and then choose Blazor WebAssembly. Go ahead and create your application. It'll take a second to start up. So I'm going to pause the video while it's doing that. And we're back and it's all set up. So this is a .NET 5 version, which will allow us to do some things like getting the project to auto build anytime we make a change. So the first thing that we're going to do is go into our pages folder here, go into index, and we're going to rip out what's here already. Give this a save, and I'm going to start a build. So like we saw in a previous video, if you have your project set up to rebuild every time you save, then you want to go to debug, start without debugging, or hit Control F5 to get your project building, popping up inside of your browser. And then I can bring Visual Studio and our application side by side here, so that if I make changes, save this, this should rebuild, and when that's done, refresh my page. So I've got my basic setup here, so we can start building out the page. And we're going to build this out in steps. So first we're going to build out the HTML. Then we are going to build some styling on top of the HTML to change how it looks and appears on the page. And then we'll sprinkle in our C# and see how we can use data binding and events to go ahead and update what's on the page as the user interacts with it. So to start things off, I want to create a couple of elements here on the page. I want to create a div. And if you hover over elements inside of the application, here they'll give you a little bit of documentation. So div is a generic container element, and it's useful for collecting a couple of children elements together for different purposes. So sometimes you need to group them for styling purposes, which is what we're doing here. So I'm going to create a div, and then I'm going to create an h1, which is our header of importance 1. And I'm going to look for the crayon emoji here, drop in a couple of those, colorizer, drop in a couple after, give it a save, should rebuild, show our application over here. Nice, good. And then let's add a paragraph underneath it that says you've picked, and we're going to change this. Right now we're just going to say the word color. But eventually we want this to be whatever background color we have selected for our colorizer application. I want to create another div, so another container here, for a couple of buttons and our input field. So buttons are elements that we can put on the page that are clickable. So I'm going to create a button that says red. And like we saw in a previous video, the Blazor template comes with Bootstrap, so you can use any of the Bootstrap classes here for styling these buttons out of the box. So button is the base style, and then button dark here will give us a dark variant of a button. So here we go, we got a red button. I can copy and paste that, get a green button and a blue button. Okay, we got red, green, blue, and then I also want to add an input. So an input element is kind of a multi-purpose element where you specify a type here that changes what information this input is capturing. So if we type in type of text, that is going to give us an input field here that allows the user to type text into it. If we were to type in type of checkbox, that is going to give us an input field that the user can click to check on and off. In our case, we're going to want a text input field. And we don't need a name on this element, and we can get rid of value as well. And we can use again, Bootstrap comes with classes for styling some of these things. So if you go to the Bootstrap docs here, go to documentation, down here to components, you can look at the different elements that come in here. So if I go into form, this is where I can see some of the form styling. And I can see that here's an email input and a password input styled in Bootstrap style. And the class that they're using here is form control. So I'm going to go ahead and say class equals form control. Whoops, not form check, form control. Give it a save, and we should go from the default styling to the Bootstrap styling. There we go. And we'll fix this. We'll change some of the styling ourselves here to space this out, give us some background color in a second. The last thing I want to do, let's give us one more button that says randomize. And this will be our button that when the user clicks on it, gives us a random color. Okay, so at this point, we've got the basic skeleton of our page. It doesn't look pretty yet, but now we can start sprinkling in some CSS to change how this page appears. So I'm going to introduce a couple of common CSS properties, and I'm going to show you two ways to apply your CSS, your cascading style sheets. So one way that we can apply style is by going to an element, saying style equals, and then we can specify a property, colon, a value. So I could say background dash color is goldenrod, and then a semicolon, and give this a save. And this style that we have specified here is going to apply only to this div. We're using the style attribute to do this. So at this point, it's good to just check out color CSS to look at the different ways that you can specify color in CSS. What I'm doing is using, if I go to this first link here for W3 schools, there are a bunch of color elements that are built into the browser using these names. So I could put in cornflower blue instead of goldenrod. And you can see as I'm typing, IntelliSense is popping up and giving me the option to autocomplete. So if I change to cornflower blue, we've now got the cornflower blue hanging up, showing up here. The W3 Schools also has a colors tutorial page that kind of goes through the different values you can use. So you can specify anywhere where you have a color, you can specify one of these color names. Or you can specify an RGB value, a hexadecimal value, an HSL value, and then in more recent versions, a HWB value. And you can see some examples here. So like if you want to use RGB, you get to specify the red, green, and blue values separated by commas. And these values go between 0 and 255. You can use hexadecimal, which uses hex to represent with 2 digits, the red, then the green, then the blue. Or, let's see, HSL is one of my preferred ways of specifying color, where you get to specify the hue, the saturation, and the lightness. And one thing to keep handy here, if you Google search HSL Picker, hslpicker.com has a nice color picker that works for the browser to give you CSS that you could paste in. So here I could find what color? Let's say we wanted a slightly different blue value. I can play with the hue, the saturation, or the brightness sliders here. And down at the bottom, it gives me a hex value, an RGBA value, and an HSLA value that I could copy in. So if I wanted, I could grab this hex and paste it in here in place of cornflower blue, give this a save, and now we should have that custom color showing up here. Let's take a quick second to break down this styling in a whiteboard. So I'm going to grab a screenshot of this code snippet. And grab a fresh whiteboard, paste it in. And grab my tablet. All right, so when we specify our styling like this would be called inline style or inline CSS. And the structure of it is that we have a property name, then we have a colon, property value, and then a semicolon to separate out multiple property settings. So we could jam multiple property settings, like we could change the background color and then we could change the color of the text all in one line here. But I'm going to show you another way to specify style that's a little bit easier for us to specify multiple properties at once. So a couple of things to notice. Your property names are often going to be kebab case in CSS, where they are lowercase words with dashes between them. And then your values, you're going to have to look up the specific properties to find what are the possible values for that property. And there are a couple of sites that I would recommend checking out. So W3 Schools is a good one. So if you just search for CSS reference, one of the first links is going to be W3 Schools. And then another one down here is going to be cssreference.io. Both of those are really good references. So W3 Schools, just like with our HTML reference page, gives us all of the CSS properties. And if you click on them, like click on background color here, gives you some examples that are interactive. So you could go ahead, try it yourself, see the CSS over here and the result over here and edit it and explore how you can change that property. cssreference.io is another good one that gives you all of those properties. So if I search for background color here, click on this, it is going to show me on the left-hand side some examples of different CSS background color settings. And then on the right-hand side, how those render. So we can see the keyword example here, or the color name example here, a hexadecimal example, a RGB, a RGBA, etc. So both of these are really handy to help you learn CSS. And one disclaimer that I will throw out there as we're getting started is that the sort of basics of CSS are easy to grasp as long as you keep one of those references handy, like changing the color, changing the background color, changing the font size. A lot of those things are really easy. And then when we get into more complex layouts, that's where the CSS tends to be a little bit more complex and you have to learn a few underlying concepts. So we're just going to get started here with playing with a few different properties, and we'll explore deeper some of those underlying fundamental principles of CSS later. Okay, so this is our inline style. And if we go back to our Blazor application, let me bring these up side by side here. we're not just limited to jamming all of our CSS here. We can actually put it into an external file and link that CSS file into our project. And actually, if you're using .NET 5, .NET 5 comes with a really handy CSS isolation by default. So if you create an index.razor.css file, that automatically is linked to your index.razor file and has some nice handy stuff. We'll talk about that later, but for now I want to show you a way that you can put style in here in addition to your HTML. So if you create a style tag, so an opening style tag and a closing style tag, you can put CSS in here that then gets applied to the elements on your page. So for instance, if I wanted to target my H1 and make the color of that H1 white, so make the text color, not the background color, give this a save. Now my H1 here is showing up with a color of white. And if I wanted to change the font size, I could change it to be 100 pixels instead of whatever its default font size here, and now the header is much larger. And I could text align. And in Visual Studio, as you're setting up this CSS, you'll see IntelliSense pops up and shows you some of those values. So we could center align, we could left align, we could right align. Change this to center, add a semicolon, and you'll see this text now shows up centered on the page. Let's make this a bit smaller. Maybe a little bit smaller here. Just trying to get it all on one line. Well, that's close enough. We're going to get rid of this styling. We're going to change this styling in a minute. But this set of styling is a bit more readable and a bit more flexible than our inline styling. So let's grab a screenshot of this, bring it over to the whiteboard and label it. Oh, whoops. Let's do that one more time. Okay, so this is our CSS in a style tag. Whoops. So some of the structure is going to be similar. We're still going to have our property name, colon, property value, semicolon. So we're seeing that here with property name of color, colon, value, semicolon. The real difference is that we have here, a selector. So this H1 says that this block of styles, so everything from the starting curly bracket to the closing curly bracket, is a style block. So this block of style is applied to all H1s. Anywhere there's an H1 on our page, it's going to show up in a color of white, font size of 50, text align of center. So the same syntax that we've got over here, we have just made it easier to target multiple elements on the page by moving over into this style tag and set up multiple styles that get applied in a style block. So this is great. This is usually the kind of styling you want to do, either doing your CSS in a style tag or preferably doing it in a separate CSS file and not inside of your Razor file. But the downside here is that anywhere where there's an H1, this styling is being applied. So if we had another H1 somewhere else on the page for some other reason that said controls, this H1 here, you can see it showing up invisibly here because it's in a color of white and it's outside of this container that had a background color. this has got the same style. And maybe when we were applying our styling to the H1 here, we just wanted this H1. We didn't want all H1s on the page. And this is really important if we wanted to start like applying style to this div, because there are going to be a lot of divs in the Blazor template. And if we apply style to all divs, we're going to run into a problem. So there are two ways that we can kind of approach this. One, instead of targeting an element, we can create a new class here. So I could call this, let's call it color riser container. So the way we create a selector that targets a class, and this is a CSS class, not a C# class, is to start it with a dot and then put in whatever name we want. And then on the elements where we want to apply this block of style, we just come in and say class equals, and then make sure that we type the name exactly as we've typed it up here. Same spelling, same capitalization. And now any styles that we put in here get applied to any element on the page where we have applied this class. So for instance, we could specify a color of white here on this div, which is going to change both the header and the paragraph to be have a foreground color of white. And let's give this a save. And looks like my something got disconnected here, so I'm just going to refresh this page. There we go. So now it's building and the styles are showing up. So you can see my paragraph changed as well as the H1. So let's get rid of this H1 styling, and we'll just stick to using our class here to apply some styles to this part of our page. So we can apply color of white, text align center to center both our paragraph and our header. Border radius allows us to bevel the corners of an element. So if I specify something like 10 pixels, that is going to bevel by 10 pixels. 50 pixels, going to be a stronger bevel there. And you can actually use percentages, like if I beveled by 50%, that's 50% of the size of the element. So let's go back to 10 pixels here for our border radius. And let's also add some padding here. So padding, let's look up our CSS reference. And we'll search for padding. You can see there are a couple of different properties for specifying padding. Padding 0, this is the default for elements. And you can see here's our element that has some background color to it. There is no padding, there's no spacing between the word target and the edges of that element. If you specify one value, like padding 30, that gives you some space within the element. So there's some space between target and the edges of that element. And you can also specify 2 values or 3 values or 4 values to have control over the top, right, bottom, and left. So we're just going to start simply with adding some padding around evenly on the top, bottom, left, and right. So here, let's just add a padding of 100 pixels and see what happens. That's not bad, but I think there's a little bit too much padding here and here. So maybe we'll keep 100 pixels on the top and bottom, and we'll use the 2 version syntax here where we specify a value for the top and bottom padding and a different value for the left and right padding. Okay, that doesn't look too bad. And while we're at it, to help make this text more readable, let's use a text shadow. So if you search for text shadow and look in the CSS reference, no shadow is the default. And then if you specify 2 values, it gives you a shadow that is offset horizontally by 2 pixels and offset vertically by 6 pixels. And you can also say how much horizontal, how much vertical, and what color the shadow should be. And then you could do the horizontal, vertical, and a blur for that shadow. So let's go ahead and drop in a text shadow that is 2 pixels by 2 pixels offset with no blur. And just to see something crazy, let's throw red in there. And so we can see that offset by 2 horizontally and vertically. And then we could use our HSL slider to find a new value. So maybe we want something that is something like this, like a light gray. And I'll grab that hex and paste it in. And now our shadow, nope, never mind. We don't want a light gray. We want a bit darker here. Let's try something like this. Whoops, need the hash. This is a save. Okay, now we have a nice dark shadow there to help add some contrast. So we've set up this class, colorize container, and we could apply it to multiple elements. So if we wanted the same styling to be applied to our container that has all of our buttons and inputs in it, we could simply just apply that styling here. And now you can see we got a bunch of padding around this element. We don't really want that padding around this element. So let's go ahead and we're going to create a new class, colorizer. Controls, and we will apply that class here. Class is colorizer controls, and let's go ahead and text align center to put those buttons centered. And we can use a margin to add some space between elements. So padding is space within an element, and then margin is space between elements. So here, if you have a couple of items and they have no margin, they're right next to one another. And then if you put margin on one of those elements, you can force it to have some space between those elements. And in fact, so it's a similar syntax to our padding where you can specify up to 4 values. And if you search in here, there are specific properties for each of those. So if we just wanted to change the margin top to add some space between this div and this div, we could just say margin top 30 pixels. Give that a save, and now we got some space here. And let's add another class for our colorizer button and colorizer input. So this class I'm going to apply here to all of these buttons. Colorizer button. And if an element has multiple classes that need to be applied to it, like BTN, BTN-dark, and colorize button, we space them out. So we have a space between all of these. And now I could change some of that styling. Like maybe I want the button to have a little bit more padding horizontally and vertically. Let's see what this looks like. So this is going to give us a little bit more padding on the top. So 10 pixels on the top and bottom and 20 pixels on the left and right. And then we could do a margin of, let's try 10 pixels. So this is going to give us a margin between all of these buttons of 10 pixels. And it's also, so it's going to be left, top, right, and bottom margin of 10 pixels. Maybe let's increase that. Let's go back to 10. 10 was fine. And then our input here, let's go ahead and apply the class that we created here. Let's set the width of this to be 300 pixels instead of, it looks like it's defaulting to be the size of our container element. And then another thing that you can do with margin that's really cool is if you set the top to whatever value you want. Here I'm going to say the top and bottom are 0, and then auto for the left and right. This will allow us to center elements. Specifically, this allows us to center block elements horizontally. The difference between inline and block, let's not worry about that right now. Let's not get too bogged down. But this should give us something decent looking for our page. Let me put these side by side. Yeah, that looks pretty decent as we resize. Okay, so we got our HTML, we got our CSS, and now we want to start linking in some interactivity using C#. A couple of things though with the CSS. So we talked about styling all elements by using an element selector, and we looked at classes using the class selector, which starts with a period. And classes are really useful when you want to define some styles that are going to be reused across multiple elements, like our buttons here. There is technically a different way that we would style things when we want to apply styles to a single element, like our div here, and that would be with something called an ID. And IDs semantically mean that you're giving this thing a unique identifier. So we're only applying styles specifically to things with this ID. I don't really want to get too deep into that. Classes are kind of more useful to learn starting out here because they're intended to be reusable. And we'll sort of dive into when to use IDs and classes later. Okay, so picking up with making this interactive. We have learned already that if we create a code block down here, we can create a field, like let's create a private string color field here. And if I set it to some value, like let's set it to crimson, I can insert this onto the page using data binding. So if I said @color here and my page finishes building and refreshing, we can see that it says crimson. So whatever I use here will show up in the page. I can use this data binding to go ahead and specify the color here in our inline styles. Whoops, made a mistake there and saved it. So that error should go away, but I'm gonna have to restart my build. Control F5, and then I can go back to this page, give it a refresh. Okay, so now our color field is driving this paragraph, and it is driving this part of the styling. Specifically, we still have background dash color colon, and then we have a semicolon at the end. We're just inserting dynamically our variable here for the value of the background color. So this was one-way data binding, and we also learned that we could create buttons that triggered some fields that we create here. So on red click, we could set our color to be something. So let's set this to be crimson, and let's start this out at blue. And this button, we're gonna use the on click event and say that when the button is clicked, call on red click. Okay, I'm going to resize this so that most of this can fit on the page. Okay, so we got our default blue showing up, and now when I click on the red button, this changes to crimson. So all we need to do is copy and paste this, create an on blue click, and an on green click. and go ahead and do our same binding here. So on click, we want to call on green click. On click, let's call our on blue click. And we won't worry about randomization just yet. So for these values that we're specifying here, then we could go to our slider and try to find values that we like. So I might try to zoom out so we can get this on the screen. I'm going to try and find some darker red, blue, and greens so that our white text shows up with nice contrast. So the third slider here gives us the lightness, which at 0 gives us black, and at 100 gives us white. So I'll slide down to like maybe 30 or so. I'm going to set the saturation all the way up. So this is going to give us, this slider goes from gray to the full color that we have selected. And then this hue allows me to fly around and find some dark flavors of colors. So here I'm going to find this red, and I could copy any of these into my project. So I could grab this hex for the red, for the blue. I could grab the RGBA, and for the green, I could grab the HSLA, and these are all equivalent. Not bad. And this default state, this is up to us. Maybe we'll set it to default to a dark gray value. So I'm going to grab the hex and default it to dark gray. Looking good so far. I want to introduce two-way data binding. So this that we're doing here is one-way data binding, where a field drives what is rendered on the page, and we're using events to go ahead and update that field so that clicking this button changes what's on the page. Two-way data binding allows us to do something like this: @bind equals, and then the value of our field. So two-way data binding means that this field drives what's in this input box, but also if someone types into this input box, it drives what's in this field. So instead of @color here, which is a one-way relationship where the field drives what's in that paragraph, this is a two-way data binding relationship. So this field drives what shows up in this box, but then if someone changes what's in this box, hits enter, that changes our field. So by default, the bind here runs when you defocus this input box. So if I change this to goldenrod and hit enter, or if I change it to RGB 255, 100, 0, and then click away and defocus, it will update here. So sometimes you want one-way data binding like we have here, and sometimes you want two-way data binding like we're doing here. Okay, so we've got our basics. We learned some CSS. We were able to use one-way and two-way data binding along with events to update our page. Let's now focus on doing something a little bit more advanced with our randomize here. So if you're looking at these values that we've pasted in, this is probably going to be a little bit more challenging to randomize for based on the knowledge that we have. This is probably a little bit easier to randomize, right? Because we could imagine having a red, green, and blue variable that we set to random values, and then we just insert them into the string here using our string interpolation. And this one actually might be the easiest for us to randomize. So if I go to the HSL slider, and let's go ahead and set our lightness to 50, saturation all the way up, and now let's take our lightness down a touch. this would be the color for this dark green. So our saturation is at 100%, our lightness is at 20% or 22%, our alpha is at 1, so opaque, no transparency. But now if we just change that first value, we're getting a random color. So HSLA, the hue goes from 0 to 360. So if I just generate a random number between 0 and 360 and then create that in a string in this format, I've got a random color. So let's use some of what we've learned already. So I'm going to create a private random number generator here. I'll call it random generator and set it equal to a new random instance. We can create a on random click. And go ahead and at on click up here, set it to on random click. Anytime this button is clicked, our on random click runs. So then we just need to use our existing knowledge of random generators to get a number between 0 and 360. So I'm going to create an integer called hue, which is what the H in HSLA stands for. Set it to a random generator value, so random generator.next, and we're going to specify a minimum value of 0 and a maximum value of 361. Remember that maximum value is exclusive, so it's always going to be impossible to get 361. It's going to be one less than this maximum. So this will give us something between 0 and 360, and then we can grab our example HSLA string here and make this an interpolated string. We're using string interpolation here to go ahead and insert our hue directly in place of where that value is hard-coded before. And let's see, let's compare here. We're using a lightness of 100, and maybe here instead of 30, let's do 22%. Give this a save, head back to our page. Should be able to hit red, green, blue, and randomize to get a random color here. And maybe this is like a little too muted. Maybe we could pump this up to 37 for the lightness. These values go from 0 to 100%. Let's see. Yeah, that's a little bit better, a little brighter. Every time we click randomize, our input is also updating, so you can see which hue value was just randomly generated. Okay, and one thing to note as you're doing this, if you made a typo, like let's say we forgot the opening parenthesis here in our string, and then we let this recompile and we clicked randomize, background color is not working. So what's going to happen if you try to specify an invalid background color in this CSS is that that property is not going to take on this element. And luckily, if we were printing that value out somewhere, like we print it to the console and we check it out, or we bound it here to the page so we can inspect it, we can see like, oh, hey, we just forgot something. So if we fix that, it'll work again. So if something's not working how you expect, you want to turn to your console, print out some of the CSS that you're trying to use, and then compare it to the reference to see like, oh, yep, I just made a small typo. The last thing that I want to show you, which is really cool about CSS, is that it has built-in animations and transitions. So one thing that you can do if you use the transition property is specify that every property, when it changes, instead of changing instantly, takes some amount of time, like half a second. And if we look at our CSS reference, let's see what we've got here for transition. You can see that this element, when we hover over it, is changing over 1 second some of the properties, the background color, the position, and then there's some different ways to control how those elements are transitioned. You can explore this more deeply For what our purposes, if we just say everything, so we use the keyword all and then space a value, that's going to transition everything over half a second. So right now this is without saving, no transitions. And then if I give this a save, let my page refresh. Now every time I choose a new color, there is a 0.5 second animation. Okay, so that's it. We learned the basics of CSS, learned some common properties, and learned how to control them using data binding and events.